Our next speaker, Michael Graves, is an architect and educator based in Princeton, New Jersey. He's the founding principal of Michael Graves and Associates. Graves gained early recognition as part of the New York Five exhibition and group organized by Arthur Drexler at the Museum of Modern Art in 1967. Since then, he has led his firm's execution of major architectural commissions worldwide, winning numerous awards. The 2001 Gold Medal of the American Institute of Architects, the highest award that it bestows upon an individual practitioner, and in 2012, the Richard H. Driehaus Prize. He's taught widely throughout the United States, including professorships at the University of Austin, Texas, Austin, the University of California at Los Angeles, the University of Houston, University of North Carolina, the University of Maryland, University of Virginia. He's currently the Robert Shermer Professor of Architecture Emeritus at Princeton University School of Architecture. In 2001, he was awarded the Topaz Medallion for Excellence in Architectural Education, a joint award of the AIA and the American Collegiate Schools of Architecture. I'm pleased to introduce Michael Graves.
I think I'll try to stand up. This will take a minute. Scott Cohen wants me to correct Greg Lynn. I was amazed that Greg was the only student ever to graduate from Princeton without having me as a critic.
I did.
Nah. Okay, and I didn't design this. Some people thought I did. Where to start? I wanted to say, the first time I came in this room after the building was finished by Rudolph was an amazing moment in this room where there was a de Kooning hanging here, the full size of this wall. And I used to come to New Haven just to see that painting. The last time I saw it was quite recently in the de Kooning show in New York. But it probably got some pretty bad treatment here because it's too valuable a piece to simply leave hanging on this wall. But most of you missed it because that was a long time ago. I think I misunderstood yesterday when somebody asked from the audience, I didn't say anything, but somebody said, we have all this training and ability now in the computer. What is there that would ever make us want to draw? That's the way I heard the question. And if it weren't a question, then it should have been. And I said to myself, with this magnificent show of Massimo's outside, how could you ever, for a moment, think that there wasn't a paradigm of drawing and conceiving and making architecture when Mario shows you the way? I mean, it's such a beautiful show. So, thank you, Bob, for putting on the show, and thank you, Mario, for being you. Massimo. I wrote out an article in 1977 that was published in Architectural Design magazine, London, and it was called Necessity for Drawing Tangible Speculation. And I am sorry that this one got the same title, but maybe you don't even know that yet. But let's just call it number 2 because it's not the same as that talk. There are little pieces of it are. I can't help that. Most of what I'm going to show you have to do with sketches, which I call sketches to remember. Le Corbusier said that we're all lazy by nature, and we see something and we say, oh, I want to remember that. and we never do unless we draw it. And so I don't care whether the drawing is good or bad or whatever, as long as it's a notation that will allow you to remember that moment of architecture or landscape or whatever it is that interests you, and why you tell yourself these stories. After I show you a number of conceptual not conceptual, but a number of drawings from my sketchbook and other references, I'll show just a moment about a second and a third generation of drawings, and we'll be finished with that. But that would be a kind of I don't know, preliminary drawing that would open the question to making a building, or keeping the drawing wet, as it were, in terms of a painter, and keeping it open and the questions unanswered, so that you could speculate and continue to speculate over a series of drawings which allow you to have the gift of yellow tracing paper or white, that one supersedes the next and you can see through. You know that Colin Rowe said that modern architecture only offered us two things. One was yellow tracing paper, transparent paper where they used to draw on, of course, opaque paper. You want to know the other. I'm looking at it, the can light. A real invention. Anyway, I will. I feel after the last three talks. I'm sorry I missed this morning, but the last three talks, this is going to be a time warp for you. It's not the 20th century; it's the 19th. I'm a dinosaur. My God, I didn't understand anything. I have a 9-year-old son who is teaching me things on the computer, and he says, "Dad, you're not thinking hierarchically." And I say, "Shut up, you little shit," you know. Anyway, he can do a lot of things that I can't do, nor do I want to do. Now, let's see. I don't know. Oh, here it is. The pointer is there. I promise not to fall. I got it. Yeah. I didn't design this either. I wouldn't have hidden it. So let's get started. I promised I wouldn't talk as long as Sir Cook. So let's go with the first slide. Do I get? Oh, it's back there. Ooh. These are randomly selected out of my sketchbook. Someday I'm going to be able to point this at the screen and it's going to go up there. Would you figure that out, Greg? That would be a real useful thing. Anyway, you can. I'm not going to read all these for you. You can read them from where you are, Park Marceau. And for me, making these drawings usually has to do with a kind of formal invention that and themes of life and death and things like that that you would find in the Park Marceau. And here on the left is a little house that I stood in front of this painting in the Louvre and drew this picture in my sketchbook because it so fascinated me. It's only this big. It's a tiny picture, those of you who know it. But it's called the Casa di Raffaello, and it's probably not Raphael's house in the Borghese Gardens. But nevertheless, here is this concave wall that, with an overhang that continues, as you see, and providing this wonderful shadow, and underneath it, what looks to be a kind of sarcophagus, being protected by that concavity. And I thought, well, maybe someday I'll be able to use that. On the right-hand side, all enunciations share this conversation, obviously. Imagine you're the Virgin, you're 14 years old, as we're told she was. No wonder she was a virgin. And the archangel comes to visit, and he's come through this opening, whether door or window, I'm not sure. And his wing seems to support a tree, which seems to support the soffit of the sky, all of that pointing heavenward. But his hand is on the door jamb, the architectural element. The separation now, in Botticelli's terms, of separation between the announcement that's going to be made by the archangel to the Virgin, and she's got her hand on the other side of the jamb, almost to say, no, it can't be. So you've got these two pressing against this column of the space. Most, as you know, those of you who care about this sort of thing, enunciations have somebody outside, the archangel outside, Virgin inside, but the inside has to be porous, so it's usually just a row of columns. So you have to get across the columns to make the announcement understood. It's very much like a cartoon, except there are no bubbles above their heads. So you've got to be able to tell the story without the literal words. So I knew I would be able to use this someday. Now here are these kind of drawings that have little to do with finding things in the landscape, but after you have started a building and are working through the plan, the section, elevations, and so on, very old-fashioned. And here is one of my early elevations of the Denver Library, and you see in the center a great rotunda, not great, but a big rotunda, which is the rare books room and reading room of the library. And you'll see these studies continuing. I just saw upstairs, the model of the Aspen Library that Greg's giving this term. And it's just so striking. That drum is so compelling to look at as a place of gathering. I have about 24 of these drawings. I'm not going to show you that many. But I do them continuously until, and as the plan changes, as you can see, the plan is changing as these drawings are done, and every time a new plan, a new elevation. And there are towers on each end. The one on the right-hand side isn't such a tower, but you see the opening below it. It's on the street face, and people coming in there. And on the other end, a closed street between the library of Gioponti and the Museum of Gioponti and our library. They continue and continue and continue until we get to here. And now you see the upper reaches of the reading room, the light coming in, held up by struts. And then the last kind of drawing that we all make, of course, is the finished drawing, the drawing that now closes the question, because probably the last thing you want is open questions when these drawings reach the hands of the builder. because that will lead to all kinds of disasters. So the best you can do is to make certain that all of these questions are understood in these drawings, and we know the devices. I'm looking forward to the day, and maybe it exists, where a young architect doing his or her first house reaches the soffit and the cornice of the building and has to keep the rain out from the roof to the wall, and can press a button that shows him all the various configurations that he can select from so he won't be sued someday. I was just sitting there a moment ago realizing this is 51 fucking years ago. I can't fucking believe it. And I'm only 37. But I show you this drawing because this photograph that my then wife took, because I was doing these huge drawing washes, 40 inches wide and 28 inches high. And it was really good paper, and I would roll it out on the street and start. And somehow I thought the enormity of these facades and buildings around required something like this. But as you see, I'm looking down. And my friend Leonard Anderson came along with me one day and said, "Michael, you're doing yourself a very big disservice. If you would draw on a little pad of paper this big, you could hold it here and look at the facade of the building, draw, and not lose the proportion, which is what you're after in the first place." It took a long time for me to realize that. I persevered and did a lot of these drawings, and I'll show you some. But I wanted to tell you, I realized I've forgotten to tell you a story about drawing that is important to me, because I often say when people ask about what are you as an architect, who people who just call you out of the blue and are writing for some no-name magazine or something, and you just start talking about architecture as a language. What does that mean? Well, I tell you this story in that I was sitting in a faculty meeting one day, and the then dean was droning on and on and on. And I was about to go to sleep, and I pulled a pad out from my briefcase and a pencil and started to make some marks on it, and was happy with the way this drawing was going, and the dean continued to drone, and I continued to draw. And then after 5 or 10 minutes, I hit a kind of spot where I didn't know what to do next, and Alan Shimikoff, who was sitting next to me, smiling and trying to keep awake himself, was looking at it. I pushed the paper over to Alan, and he made half a dozen marks and shoved the paper back to me. And then I did the same, and we started to run out of paper. We started to fill it up. So without saying anything to each other, it was first half a dozen, and then 4, and then 3, and then 2, and then very precious marks. And Alan had reached a point where he didn't know where to go either. And sitting to his side was Tony Vidler, who was here the other day. And Tony Vidler dropped in a stare twice too big. And Alan smiled and I smiled, and you could say, well, it's either that Tony is a verbal type and didn't know, or Tony, being a visual type, which he is, didn't know, and he was going to win. He was going to end the game. the game was over. But it was a language shared by two people, three really, and it needed no words. It had no rules, except the rules we made as we went along. To me, that's the real glory of it. It's what we do as critics when we sit down with students. They draw a line or two, and we do the same, and the game is on. I remember sitting in a crit with Colin Rowe once when he was teaching at Princeton, and the student finished his presentation to just the two of us, and of course it wasn't what he was trying to do, it was how many of this and how many of that he had, and we didn't care. But Colin, in his kind of palsy way, was, well, you could do this, and a column appeared, and this, and this, and then there's a wall here. Now look what you've got between the wall, the space, the column in its space, and the space beyond. And the student said, well, why didn't I think of that? Because you didn't draw it. You just got to keep drawing. So there are a number of these pictures that I did on the ground there that I showed you a minute ago. This one is Santa Nome di Maria near the Forum, and then on the right-hand side, of course, Santivo della Sapienza. It says Alla Sapienza, but that's wrong. And it's always a good idea, look up at the top to plan ahead when you're doing a drawing. Now, one of these, and this is a phenomenon that I'm going to show 2 or 3 times now. One of these is obviously an object in the round, and the other one is in a forecourt, presumably designed by Michelangelo, though nobody knows whether it was or not. Together with the culmination of that forecourt, which is the facade of Santivo, itself clearly in the round, but giving it up its objecthood to this frontal view. I don't know whether you know, but all the fountains in Rome are there, of course, to celebrate water, but they're bringing the water from the Campagna outside of Rome into the city in various places through the aqueduct system. Once they reach the city, imagine the city as a kind of valley, the water falls, and it falls down into a series of positions, each one of them then made into a fountain. And then under the streets, another fountain. And finally, it gets down into the city itself, and people can, or did, of course, use it as drinking water. It's pure. It's marvelous. But here again, we have the frontality of the Acqua Paola near the American Academy in Rome. And then the Tritone fountain near the Borghese. Again, plan ahead. But it is in this fountain of the Acqua Paola that I realized that why water in some fountains looks clear and white and blue, and in other fountains you don't see it. The water is rushing just as much. Do you know why that is? It's because the stone behind it, when dark, reflects the light back into the rushing water, and you see the water. It's an easy lesson to learn, but it's a lesson if you ever use water and you want your water to be visible, then you make the surface behind it dark. Piranesi took great liberties with some of the buildings that he drew. etched. And here in the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine, 312, he made a building that is at least twice too long. You see it disappearing in Miriam's vanishing point down at the end. Mine is much more what is there on the right-hand side. The composition is, in both cases, however, to show the chiaroscuro. As I was so dumbfounded with this building when I first saw it, as this is the small part of the building. As you see, I can point to it up there in the center, where the arch would spring to the great nave of the basilica, a building many times larger than the enormity of what you already see. I took a lot of photographs when I was in Rome for 2 years. And here is the Imperial Forum. And then on the right, not unlike that, the Domus Augustana, which is really the foundations for Augustus's house. Now you can just imagine these were always wine storage and other kinds of places for the servants to live and so on. But what marvelous ruins they make. Lucan found that when he went to Rome for the first time, drawing the ruins and imagining what the completion of that composition would be like. Here, Piranesi looks into Minerva Medica. And in a way, I love this etching of his, because I'll show in the last slide today how Piranesi, though we love many of the things he did, and a lot of people, like my friend Peter, loves the Carcere drawings, they show construction. And he was really telling the architects of the day how the Romans built their walls. And so he's very, very thorough and careful to show the opus reticulatum, the various coursing methods. All of that is open for us, as he didn't draw these just as picturesque vignettes to sell, which he did, but nevertheless, they were always a lesson for architects. But I always found this particular interior of his rather muddy, when in fact, my painting on the right, I know it's about drawing, but my painting on the right after Corot shows again the chiaroscuro of the interior of that. And certainly, even if the dome were completed before it collapsed, you would see through those windows those very sharp contrasts that building offers you. This is a drawing by Ingres, and it is a stairway that many of you know, the Articelli stair. And there is the Articelli at I can point to this one, up at the top with its very curious facade. And it stands there, and I think that Ingres understood that this long, long flight of stairs, where nuns once a year on some saint's day go up those stairs on their knees until they're bloody. What all that does, I don't know, but they do it. And into the church for penance. But at the end of that walk is the starkness of this very peculiar and wonderful face with its Baroque door and its simple face. He almost cancels out the rest of the Campidoglio with the extension of his stair and the second piece of paper. I don't know why I bring this today, but there was my stair. I even put the paper the wrong way to show the length of the stair. Should have done it again. Think ahead. Here's Santa Maria Maggiore, by Piranesi, and the wonderful colonnade which separates the nave from the ambulatory on the side, you see along here. And then look above it, you'll see that the whole top, the clerestory, is gridded out and somehow making it fragile by virtue of the gridding of all of that. And when contrasted to Santa Maria in Cosmedin, Le Corbusier's favorite building in Rome, you see a similar, though primitive, colonnade, and the wall above it with no detail whatsoever until you get to the top with the clerestory windows. The whole wall seems to be a piece of paper, so dematerialized that it's fragile. We know Le Corbusier tried to use that later. I'll show you here. There's a drawing that I did of La Tourette, and whether you look at the side wall, as in Cosmedin, or the end wall, both of them have that peculiar, wonderful flatness that he did to tell the story of what? Of what's on the ground. Look at the cross, the altar, the figure on the left. All of that is now bound up in a landscape that is clarified by the severity of the walls. At least I think they are. Let me go back. I'm really getting good at this. Look at the ceiling of La Tourette. There is a texture to the ceiling, and it's a slightly grayer color of concrete, not the white as the end surface. There is a sense, as in painting, of rendering the sky plane, the soffit, so that you enclose and can call attention to the sky by virtue of giving it color or texture. Oops. Here he is in Ronchamp, my drawing, and as Charles Jenks says, the nun's hat of the roof seems to be cradled by a wall that is not concave, but is hollowed out at the top. Le Corbusier had said in his new biography that I'm just reading now that he wanted the roof to be weightless. I find that it weighs a ton. But weightless, I find that it's weightless, no, but when inside or out, you see the wall, if I can point to it, the wall that supports that roof is this thick. So he's building up this wonderful bastion of a wall supporting the roof. And the roof too then, for him, is a part of the celestial soffit. On the left-hand side, Santa Augustana is there next to the Domus Augustana. And I should have said Anastasia. But here, the building it fools the eye. It looks like it's concave. It's not. It's doing exactly the same thing as the wall of Le Corbusier's church is doing. It's just cut down in the center. But as you approach it, you start to see the flatness of the wall, but it starts to envelop you at the same time, simply by cutting it down in this very unorthodox manner. When at Paestum, Piranesi made many drawings, etchings, and most of them were three-dimensional in the sense of three-quarter views, like the one we see here, where you can really sense the space around the columns. But I didn't want to do that when I was in Paestum. I wasn't aware of Piranesi's drawing, but just when seeing these temples one after the other lined up as they are, as some of you know, I wanted the proportions and the frontalities to then be scrims on the stage of development of all the temples, because this is certainly not the way they were meant to be seen, because they would have had roofs and more obscurity. Here, the Santa Maria in Carcere. Peter, this is the only Carcere I've got. Here on the left, obviously stands as an object, and I wanted to see it that way. We saw it yesterday in one of the talks. And then adjacent to that, just the opposite in Siena, where we see the space of the Campo. Again now, as I've graded the sky comes over as a kind of diaphanous film over the top of the square and gives you the spatial understanding of it, as does this De Chirico here, where he has, in the enigma of the afternoon, as he calls it, he has made the sky very dark with a light horizon, as if it's a sheet of fabric that can be pulled over the square and enclosing this square as a room, the way I intended to make the Campo. Very near the Academy, there's a garden you pass if you walk down in the morning, as I used to do. There's a little garden that you actually walk through to get to the city. And this garden has in it a kind of open arm, and you enter right at the corner there, and take its stairs down into the city. And I knew, after I found the plan of it in the Academy Library, and you can see I've drawn red lines through the central axes of first the concavity, and then the drum, the little chapel next to it, and then the big chapel behind. How all of those have their centers documented by the room adjacent to it. Below that was in my sketchbook, but since it's there, I would say that in the center of the Plosek house, you see the axis through to what was going to be a pavilion in the garden, never was. And then on the right-hand side, a kind of English garden started by the ragged nature of the wall, which wasn't built quite like that. But it was to offset the rigidity of the central axis into a different kind of garden structure. One of the great plans of all time, I remember sitting in a coffee bar with Judy Mayo once, and she said, "Michael, can you draw the plan of the Hotel de Montignon?" And I said, "I could try." And being a kind of fan of French hotel plans, I knew the gist of it, because the building has, on the right-hand side, let me see if I can do this, right-hand side, right up here, if you enter there, you'll be not on foot, but in a carriage. And this whole contraption over here is the stable. So in you go, and you go up to the center, you're dropped off, and the stable hand takes the horse and the carriage back to be housed back there. Read across the facade of this plan, and you'll read A, B, C, front door, B, A. And if you go from the front door back, you'll see that the piece of property owned by the family is actually the whole, incorporating the plan of the stable. So now we've got a door entering here and a center axis in the garden, which is here. So the whole game is to make 4 rooms in there as you see them. Again, I'm at this disadvantage here to get you to the center of the composition, to the B in my ABCs. So Judy and I drew it together, both like the Chimakov drawing, both adding something and erasing something else. We got pretty close. And I conclude with these pictures of the aqueduct coming into Rome, a little terracotta sketch that I did. And from that, I thought how marvelous it would be to do a painting, which I did, based on a painting by Corot, up in the upper right. And it's too bad from the distance you are from it, you can't see the aqueduct on either side. You only see the little piece of ruin in the center. But here is Piranesi on the upper left, making the aqueduct not linear as I have seen it, stretching across the landscape, which is what took my breath away. But up close, he sees the aqueduct as a piece of architecture, very much like the Basilica Maxentius, where you see him looking in these arches. And not the linear network at all, but the verticality of it. And then the construction. And he tells you down here about the Roman construction. And then over that construction, he slides some of the ruins. The spolii have been asked to call your attention to those words. And in fact, casting a shadow over the words, the visual then becomes the language which supersedes the literal. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Sunil Bald. I teach here at the school. I teach design studios at both the advanced core level as well as visualization. I'll be very brief. I just have 2 questions, one for Marion and Scott together, and then one for Greg and Michael together. Before that, if you'll indulge me with a minute, and I mean a minute, just to review some of the themes. The word drawing has the enviable trait of being both an action and an artifact. Drawing considered as an action is arguably more inclusive to varied techniques, technologies, and ambitions, either as a means to an end or as an end in itself. Both processes of drawing from something and drawing towards something have been and continue to be integral to the design process, as we know from the rigorous explorations of our distinguished panel of architects and educators here. Michael Graves spoke of the referential sketch and preparatory sketch, while Greg distinguishes drawing's creative and critical capacity from drafting's metric burden. So while as architects we can speak of drawing from architecture and drawing towards architecture, we cannot say drawing of architecture without being grammatically incorrect. And since I'm at Yale, with the dean in the front row, above all, I must be grammatically correct. Therefore, I would like to consider the drawing of architecture, drawing as artifact, not fetishistically, but as a metaphorical method of entry into the themes introduced by our speakers this afternoon. Specifically, I would like to consider the imagined boundaries of the drawing, of the page, the frame, to establish the setting of the interplay between architecture and observer, or as Michael relayed in his game between bored Princeton colleagues. However, the integrity of the frame is broken as Marion Weiss wanders off the point through explorations of sectioning, seriality, and superpositioning. Scott Cohen's cinematic analysis dissolves the notion of the singular autonomous frame to the point where he can claim the dissolution of drawing as a whole. And finally, the frame becomes absolutely promiscuous in its relationship to object and environment through the ease of digital panning and zooming. On that note, I'd like to begin with my question for Scott and Marion, and I hope it engages the both of you in a conversation with each other about each other's presentations as well. It's around the disruption of the singular frame, of which I just spoke, through sectioning and projection, which both your presentations really beautifully described, although in different ways, I thought. Each of you also discussed this phenomenon relative to the drawing's demise relative to other media, Marion with photography and Scott with film, which introduced narrative to the discussion, particularly in Scott's paper. In your discussion, Scott, narrative structure acts as an analog to negotiate between the difference or sameness as made manifest in architectural plans, most compellingly in the montage model. You discuss, while Marion, in your drawings, the narratives implied a more phenomenological and material motivations, especially in the way that architecture and landscape integrates with each other. So I was wondering if you could each discuss the opportunities and limitations between projection as method of formal invention on the one hand, and projection as a cognitive act for material and experiential exploration on the other.
You go first.
Well, first of all, it's interesting. I hate to tell you, I don't really think about the drawing as an artifact. I mean, well, you did say it when you said that I thought it had dissolved entirely, but it's not so much that it had dissolved entirely then. I guess for me, if we can think through drawing, to think architecture is not to draw. They're not the same thing. I mean, think through writing, but what it is we're writing is what we should be dealing with and thinking about here. I mean, I guess it would be strange to be talking about writing without talking about what we were writing. So I'm a little bit troubled by the whole conversation about drawing, actually, as a standalone problem. I did, though, find it curious to discover that we might think about how it had disappeared regardless of the computer, because I don't think that really is the point from which we should depart to think about whether it is here or not, dead or alive. But that's really beside the point, actually. Strangely enough, probably the only really interesting point for me in the whole piece that I was showing was the fact that Bramante needed to invent the anamorphosis to make the plan. And that was the one moment when, you know, it was an architectural problem, not, let's say, just drawing. It wasn't perspective any longer. Anyway, I guess for me, the question would be whether or not we could talk about the way in which the computer is apparently bringing to bear problems, you know, challenges for architecture to overcome, but that in fact, well, drawing may or may not have done that, the computer may or may not. The fact is those problems are inherent. I think the more interesting problems are those that are intractable, that are dominant to architecture, that dominate architecture, not those that are sort of academicized and carved out of this very special territory as we do it in schools, focusing on, you know, technique as the genesis of architecture. I don't really think the technique is the artifact that makes architecture. I don't know, I would start with that.
That was a panoramic cross-section arc of critique.
I'm sorry, it doesn't really address the other side of the equation, what you were referring to for Marion, which is this question of other phenomena that may or may not implicate drawing, which I've never dealt with. I've never shaded. I've never once thought that a drawing should try to deal with any of those things. It just has never interested me. So I don't know, there we really would differ, I suppose. I've never drawn the way Kahn did, for example.
Well, I'm not sure anybody here has. I think much of the kind of cross-section, if you will, of engagement that's come across a lot of the discussion both yesterday and today is that architecture doesn't happen without some sort of pre-representation before we get there. And that pre-representation is recognized in plan, it's recognized in section by those who've been trained to be architects, but it's been illustrated by painters, captured by photographers, indicated by filmmakers in so many different ways that in fact this very act of the drawing or the artifact is a fictional sort of thing, whether it's notational to all the way up to, shall we say, the most exquisitely rendered digital for sale Dubai Towers. There's this whole spectrum that says that it's still in advance of, until we can get there, the architecture. And I guess the kind of postponement that I described in those drawings for the Sterling studio was this utter panic that when we reached the finish line, I hated the way it looked. And so the need to keep on going with the imperfection very, very quickly in so many different ways led to, in a sense, a kind of retroactive manifesto at each time to find the vanishing points that hadn't been cast in there and start to find the precision so that as it advances its way, in our case, towards architecture, at that point we become very dependent upon the computer's capacity to start to calibrate these things in precise terms and allow them to become elastic again. So I think that this question of the artifact of the drawing, is it dead? The frame of it, you already said that once we can go in motion in this kind of parametric area, we no longer are obligated to that frame, but look what we're obligated to. The perception of what we're seeing through a flat surface. Piece of paper, screen, it's still flat. Film, projection, still flat. And so it's that flatness representing the non-flat that then gets us to the thing that gets built. And that's where the drawing and the resistance, if you will, of that particular medium happened to stimulate the kind of coincidence that Jasper Johns found, or that we find with surface and landscape, that somehow that's not part of this discussion at all. In a sense, it's somewhere else. But there it is. The very fact of it starts to indicate some tactility in making.
But you know, for example, I mean, I would say that drawing, for me, this distinction between drawing for picture making, or what the drawing looks like and how it would make a picture, is so different than the drawing that solves a problem. I mean, for example, if a drawing is like a plan, if we think of the plan as a drawing, actually, which in a way it isn't if drawing is picture making, we'd have to talk about what we mean by drawing. It wouldn't matter what it looks like. We don't read through the way we deal with this question of drawing the plan, for example, anything looking like anything. I never thought a plan was beautiful for how it looked. I mean, I'm sure Michael Graves has often thought it, but this wasn't what it was. I mean, I loved the plan where he and Judith DeMaio tried to, understand it. This is what was beautiful about it, not what it looks like. Anyway, this is the fundamental difference between us. I mean, I think for you, you are probably invited through what a drawing looks like to proceed to, think through certain things further, and even to have it evoke, make vague and open-ended, to be suggestive and all of those things.
I need to get on the couch.
No, I mean, that's how I think you're seeing the drawing. And for me, it never did anything like that at all. It never invited me through its appearance. I've never been interested in that whatsoever. It's really a very different, we're really very quite different on this.
Well, actually,
though you might think that we have something in common based on the fact that we're dealing with making buildings a certain way. That is, as we proceed to make them in the world beyond drawing.
Well, actually, on the note of the picture that you talked about in your paper, as well as something that defined drawing, It brings up, I think, a issue that I'd like to engage Greg and Michael about, which is something that hasn't really been discussed so much, I think, in this conference, and seems that maybe a somewhat conventional way of thinking about drawing, or an aspect of drawing, which is composition. And I was struck in Michael's presentation about in the referential sketches, the role of composition as a way of establishing an interaction between the observer and the architecture. And that as a kind of productive conversation that then, with Greg's image or reference to the Snyderman house, of then how that translation of composition into a rigorous investigation of geometry occurs from the referential sketch to the preparatory sketch as you described it. And then for Greg, whose work is so kind of tied into these kind of rigorous investigations of geometry, what role composition plays in your work?
You want me to lead? I'm not leading it.
You better reframe that question.
I see pretty clearly. Okay.
You're on, Greg.
So actually, Michael,
Composition.
can you just maybe talk about, as you were doing the sketches, just how composition played into it, and how it engaged you, and then how what you learned from that act then fed into the preparatory sketches in investigations in geometry for projects like the Snyderman house.
But I'm kind of breathless because I don't know how you would make a drawing without thinking about composition.
No, I agree. But it's something that I think that students and that we often as teachers, we actually neglect to talk about these days. So to hear you talk about it, I think is an important thing.
Well, sure. I just realized that somehow, I don't know if they showed or not, but there were a couple of slides that didn't come up. One of St. Peter's Square. And it showed a pair of columns next to a pair of columns by Piranesi of the Pantheon. And both of them are off axis. But both of them, because of the pairing of the columns, gather in what is there that you are to identify with. In the case of St. Peter's Square, one of the fountains. There are two fountains and an obelisk, and so as you go around the colonnade of Bernini, there's always something that draws your attention to the foreground before the background of the facade, or the middle ground to the background of the facade. But for me, that's what it's all about. Mm-hmm. So I couldn't do otherwise. Is that wrong?
No, that's... Greg?
Well, I mean, I guess the kind of, my response in the headline for how I'd like to, shape the discussion is that I think Friday and maybe even this morning there was an assumption that the precision of digital tools is all about clarification and fixing things, and the immediacy of the sketch is all about creating things. And all I'd like to say, I mean, it probably not the norm nor any indication of the way things are going, but for me it's exactly the reverse, that I find what would have been drafting tools previously to give me a volumetric and spatial freedom and quickness that then gets concretized more in like a pen and ink drawing. Like I'll use a pen and ink drawing to fix the stuff that's being modeled loosely in a CAD software, and then use that information that's in a pen and ink drawing to go back and regulate the CAD stuff. So, which is just very the opposite of what we've been told for the last 36 hours. Mm-hmm. So, I think, I don't use vignette, but if I do, it tends to be in the CAD package just because there's 1 out of 4 windows that's constantly giving me these vignettes. But it's the clarification and precision actually happens after rather than before.
But it seems to me that you're really suggesting that architecture either way is indebted to technique.
For
Is
sure.
that, and that's it for you? I mean, is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's.
Well, can I maybe
I mean, for
throw
example,
a question
How do you design?
no, for example, we were just in a beautiful lecture by Philip Glass last night at Harvard, in which he said that technique has nothing to do with music.
He's totally lying. The guy's
Yeah.
used the same technique
No,
for
but-
40 years.
No, the way he. No, but the way he thinks about music. I mean, or the way he conceives it. The
Well,
way
no,
he
it's-
thinks he conceives it. Even if it isn't true, it's the way he thinks he conceives it, and that it doesn't come from technique.
Well, no, it's
Why is
second
all of
nature.
architecture technique?
No, it's got to be second. You want to
Yeah.
learn technique until it becomes second nature.
Of course,
you
but that
have
is
to have
that
technique.
is it architecture though? Technique itself?
No, you have to learn technique.
You have to learn it. I didn't say you have to learn it. I said you think architecture is indebted to the techniques. In other words, it comes from technique for you. My question is that what you think, or do we need to have technique and
No, no,
master it
it's-
to
well,
do something else,
No, I think it's a discipline.
which is architecture? Yeah.
With a medium. One of the things that I am not proud of is
Yeah.
that, the recent history, high temples of learning have been teaching things like Photoshop,
Yeah.
like vocational training. And I think that shouldn't be happening at all. I don't think that we need to teach vocational technique. However, I do think, the quote about learning to see,
Yeah.
the Hockney quote, I think
Yeah.
is very right. You have to learn to draw to learn how to see. You have to learn how to draw to learn how to compose. I think technique's absolutely instrumental and necessary.
Can I maybe add to this equation then? Because I do think that what happens is that for anybody who, as I have, studied a certain musical instrument, like piano, for a certain period of time, you do thousands of exercises until you no longer think about what you're doing. And at that point, it becomes your native tongue, if you will. So you could say that every media that we work in becomes a native tongue, and there's intrinsic intelligences that move easily because it becomes native. And so the digital media, I would say, for the current generation that's learning, is their native tongue. And I'm struck by the incredible awkwardness of sketching and drawing, which I don't mind. I'm just struck by it, how clumsy and awkward most people who are in architecture now, when they're very young, can draw, and yet how graceful, if you will, their particular medium, call it the piano, for instance, because they've been doing it, and it is an effortless way to visualize, envision, wander, dream, effectively do all the postponing that you could say of decision-making that watercolor or charcoal or whatever has allowed. And the thing I'm intrigued by, though, is sort of setting aside the assumptions of either or truth, or analytical is better than this is better than that, but that if we start to see that there's predispositions of media, and certainly there are predispositions, you can loft and do all kinds of things you say better than with that flaccid, if you describe that kind of strange thing, that you can do these very easily in some media and not in others. And then when you're drafting, you can draw a straight line very easily because all the tools are geared towards a straight line. So that if my hunch is sort of shifting here, at least in terms of our work, is that if we can actually take each of these medias to their logical Darwinian conclusion of what they can do and then set them aside when they can no longer do something, that maybe what we've left on the cutting room floor still has value when we move into the next medium. And we kind of like to keep them within earshot and eyesight because they might actually start to ask the other medium to do something new. And that's where I was very excited actually about some of the presentations earlier that all of a sudden took on a computational art form that had a kind of scatter potential, that had a fluidity and a suggestiveness that, in a sense, did everything from what you said was the suspicious position of the perfection and concretizing that parametric discussions were going on yesterday.
Okay, I think we should open it up. Any questions? In the front? Oh, wait for the microphone. Yeah.
People eager to hear your question.
Yesterday, Professor Brothers brought up the possibility of an empathetic muscle response when looking at a drawing. So that if one is a drawer, one could look at a drawing and would have a corporeal feeling as if one was drawing that. And I guess I'm curious if the digital native, I think that this possibility is indeed probably true, and I'm wondering if a digital native could have that same sort of experience. This might be towards
Digital maker.
Professor Lin or to Mr. Rees.
No, of course.
Well, I'm just curious because it doesn't happen with me, and I'm wondering if you could describe that.
He's had that experience.
Sorry to be rude, but it's only because you don't know what you're looking at. If you know what you're looking at, you have the response. So, but you can't say just because you don't know what you're looking at with a digitally modeled tool, that you don't have exactly the same response when you see something which is done with an ink wash. I mean, if you know how to do an ink wash and you know how to do, Boolean composition of solids, when you see the Boolean composition, you have the same response. It's just you have to know what it made it. But intrinsically, there's nothing about digital images that you'd have any empathy for unless you produced things digitally, and then you have the empathy for it. Just like perspective. If you don't understand how perspective's constructed, you don't have the same feeling towards seeing a perspective. There's really no difference between a digital tool and any of those crazy instruments Andrew showed this morning.
In the back?
Excuse me. So, drawings necessarily, both digital and hand drawings, come with a certain sense of authority to them. They convey a message, and they do so in a way that says this is it sets down a line, it sets down a truth to a degree. And I guess my question is, for the whole panel, and the difference between, or the scale of cross drawing, whether it be sketching through technical drawing all the way up to 3D digital modeling. The question of sort of how true the representation is to what it is, to what it's trying to represent. So if we draw something in a 3D digital model, it looks like the thing it's going to be. It looks like the thing we want it to be. We draw a column, it looks like a column.
Better than what Michael does?
No, not necessarily better.
I think he's way better than a computer at capturing what things look like.
But I'm saying there's an immediacy to it looking like what we want it to look like. I guess I'm.
Well, I'm a
It's
terrible
very hard to
renderer,
describe
so
what
I
I'm trying to
disagree
say.
with you. But
You make a wall in a 3D modeling program, and it's a
That's 'cause
wall.
you're bad at
You
it.
draw a line on a piece of paper, it's a line. It represents a wall, but you see it as a wall in a 3D modeling program. I guess
We like what we can
do you find that the directness of the representation becomes inhibiting to the openness or possible misreadings of things, and possible openness to new interpretations of the drawing? I guess I see hand drawing as being open to multiple interpretations because it's less concretely defined in my understanding of it. This is really rambling, and I'm sorry.
Well, actually, Michael, would you like to
Well,
take that on?
No, I don't know whether I can, but perhaps the problem is you haven't made a good column, or a really significant wall, or a wall without a story. Maybe it's just 4 lines. It's not a wall, it's 4 lines. But when it's in context, as I showed in Cosmodine, then you can talk about its nature. But maybe you're not giving yourself enough lines.
Dan?
Is that question very brief for Scott? I find Scott's talk very persuasive, very provocative, but it has the effect, at least in my reading, of demoting the plan as just an epiphenomenon of section. And I don't want to sound like I'm fetishizing tradition or the plan or Vitruvius, but Vitruvius certainly started his first important triad with the ichnographia, with the plan. And many architects have had the thought, the myth, the fantasy that the plan is the generator, among which is core. So what would you say to this theoretical emphasis on the plan that you find already in the inaugural text of classical architecture, which may not be inaugural, but it's the only one we have left?
Well, I mean, I think the point I was trying to make is the plan is it comes after architecture. It isn't the generator of it anymore once we can imagine it wholly so that we can make a perspective of it. I mean, the idea in the Renaissance that you could conceive in your mind a building wholly rather than having it only exist, for example, as it did in the early Renaissance and earlier, as a drawing on the ground that would later give rise to something else that it wasn't yet understood, is what makes the plan what you would call demotes the plan. It doesn't demote it, it turns into something else. It redefines what it is. I mean, Corbusier in a way is returning to an earlier idea of the plan, which is a very radical act. And of course now we're back to the perspectival plan, the plan that's after. We're back to that again. I mean, it raises the question of whether Corbusier, of course, is, you know, ahead of us or behind us, or we're certainly not in the time that he was in, vis-a-vis this question of the plan's role.
But you're really a follower of Peruzzi then. You're really a follower of Peruzzi because of the sectional...
The sectional plan. I don't know whether I am or not. By the way, I didn't say whether what I think about the plan for me. I'm just talking about what I think it becomes, and when you think about the 20th century's successive stacking of space, which we still have as a problem. I was telling Patrick when he was at Harvard 2 days ago that despite all of his curves, he still collages it, which he's absolutely against collage, you know, the many flat slabs that pile up and get clipped off by his curved shapes. He still has the intractable elevator. You know, he has it all that they all did have, beginning with the invention of those things. So he hasn't been able to deal with these intractable problems. I think there are problems that are intractable to architecture that raise higher stakes than the problems that computation does when we move away from the problems that are intractable to architecture. In other words, the problems that are intractable to the computation in the production, for example, of product, you know, furniture, products, and other things, are very different than the problems that are intractable to things, you know, to the constraints we deal with in architecture. There, in those kinds of constraints, you know, we really have a different problem. I mean, if we're going to deal with this medium as architecture, if you're going to say it is architecture, technique is architecture, then, you know, I don't know where you are vis-a-vis, for example, these things that are in architecture still, that we can't get out of unless you just don't deal with them.
Well, if you're not interested in plans, I would think you'd start to get more interested in design industries that don't use plans.
Yeah, no, I'm not, but I would still be interested in doing buildings. I mean, so it's the problem, maybe.
No, but I think
that's what holds me back.
I mean, one of the things about the morning's discussions, let's say, is the influence of aerospace and other fields on our CAD software has kind of changed the possibilities of the tools. And I think that's, you know, Patrick and Andrew were talking a lot about how if you lose the primacy of the plan, the way somebody at Boeing would when they think about a fuselage, changes your spatial models.
Definitely.
And it probably does cause you to go around clipping floor plates and clipping elevators. But I think that's part of the world we're living in is, you know, a lot of these tools we made have gone into other places and are coming back to us with all kinds of new valences. I mean, which I find really interesting.
But meanwhile, architecture stays behind them.
You need to do a spoon. I mean, everybody up here is done like a spoon except you.
That's true.
You better get on it if you want to be serious.
Yeah, but you need to do a building, which everybody here has done.
Done like a spoon.
Okay.
One last question.
Actually, well, and Marcelo after that, and then we'll have to.
I just wanted to say that the last 3 days have been a real roller coaster ride for me. So I just wanted to thank everyone for coming and enlightening us. I think the real issue that I'm having is that maybe drawing isn't really dead because I draw and I use a computer and I have no problem going between the two. But maybe what's actually dead is looking, because everyone keeps on talking about how no one's looking, and maybe we just have a really short attention span now. So I'm not sure if that's something that you guys want to shed some light on, because I've had to train myself very hard to look at things without any training or any technique. It's just a case of looking. So is it the fact that we don't look anymore, but we just sort of quickly just glare and move on?
Or Mary?
I think you have to be a kind of visual savant to survive. I think you have to look at everything. I think you have to look at the place you're in. I think you have to look at what people are wearing. I think you have to look at the way they're acting. I think everything is a part of what we do. It's never discussed. But my mother once said to me, "Oh, you're so sensitive," which was a put down. And I said, "Thank you." Because I noticed that she was pissed off about something, and I didn't catch her at it, but I just recognized it. But how do you make buildings for people if you aren't aware? If you just got to do it?
My mother said the opposite. She said, stop looking in people's houses whenever you pass.
Okay.
She said, stop looking.
Actually,
Well, there is one thing I would add. I keep encouraging graduates to apply for the Rome Prize and go with a computer and start modeling historic buildings. And I've been trying to get people to do this for 10 years. Nobody does it.
Good.
It's true. No, it's because they all go to work for Bob.
Oh, those.
No, but they don't take a computer to Rome.
No. I really don't think a lot of people are going to start to understand it until you start to think of these things with surfaces. And I really can't think of anything more important for a recent graduate to do than take this tool set and go look, I mean, the same way Michael was, but with this new medium. And it's also, from a historical and theoretical perspective, going to shed all kinds of new light on this historic work.
It's absolutely commensurate with the architecture of Rome. I mean, that would be the point I was trying to make. The computational period is commensurate with the perspective. And clearly, if you model Baroque architecture computationally, you are going to take it much further in understanding contemporary problems than if you are, you're kind of held back by what you're limited by drawing by hand.
Also, I like going to model Vitone because it's all about surfaces. Anyway, I think there's a lot of looking at history that today could learn from.
So much.
That everybody doesn't.
But people are doing it, Greg, at Harvard, by the way. Yes, they are.
Right. Well, Michael told me he's got something on St. Evo. So. But anyway, I think that's really the big task, is people think you look with a sketchbook and they're not looking with the digital tools. I think you have to do both.
Cameron Wu is doing the best work computationally on the Baroque that I've seen.
Okay.
There's really some great things going on.
Okay, well, I promised Marcelo, so he'll be the last question, and then
all right. Yesterday, Antoine ended his lecture with saying something around that the fictional possibilities of drawings were still in a very early age. And I thought that, with the whole premise of the conference, suggested to me something more like the relation between what I would see as a kind of end of the modeling culture, that is such a kind of close, immediate relationship with the object, in the computer, that two-dimensional aspects of drawing, to me, suggests ways out beyond possibly a new generation of work. I mean, in terms of the possibilities of it, and clearly Casey's work pointed towards that, in terms of how very simple things suggested a complete new space, three-dimensional. So I wonder whether Greg or Scott, which are to me very, very different ends of the spectrum in terms of not only the work, but the three-dimension or projection, which I associate more to two-dimensional, have any thoughts on that? On, let's say, the possibilities of that to kind of engage, just not, new sensibilities towards the work.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, no, Marcelo, it's not as much a question as a statement.
Yeah, no, I'm buying time by asking Greg to please go first.
Well, no, I really feel like as being in the transition from drafting with analog tools to drafting with digital tools and drawing with analog, sketching and drawing with analog and sketching and drawing with digital, that it's tough for me to answer that question because I'm exactly not that person. I'm a person that was trained one way and then had this technology come in and make me an amateur and try to learn it. So I really think it's the next generation. It's probably the wrong panel to ask that of. Your generation, which we're close to the same age, but it's an important 5 years or something, where you probably learned these mediums native in a way that I didn't.
I mean, I think if you're interested in what a lot of people are today with in more complex systems of work, I mean, the kind of things Patrick, for example, is talking about, I don't know if he's still here, but anyway, you know, if you are really trying to go into a new domain of, you know, thinking about architecture through these technologies, there's no question this is absolutely impossible at an earlier moment. And so this, not to mention the fact that the object is made, you know, in so fundamentally a three-dimensional way that, you know, we can't think about drawing as we did before. There's just no question about that. In that sense of it, we cannot. I mean, it depends what you think the conventions are of architectural thought. I mean, the medium through which we think it and how important those particular conventions are. And I would say, for example, the plan is still important. The plan, despite Patrick, is still in his buildings. So it's an interesting question. I think it goes to something Marion is trying to talk about, which is the layering of different conventions, traditions, despite, let's say, the obsolescence of one and the emergence and supremacy of another. There's an inevitable simultaneity.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
It's
So-
Patrick.
sorry.
You gotta know it. Patrick. Oh my God, Patrick.
Oh, Patrick.
Patrick.
Okay,
Well,
Patrick.
Patrick, it better be shorter than your
Okay.
talk.
I apologize, but I have to butt in on this point. I mean, fascinating discussion, and I think that I want to make the following reminder and draw together some of the themes. I mean, Scott mentioned we need to reflect on not only just drawing as an activity, what are we supposed to be drawing, the content, the ambitions, the architecture which is envisioned at the end of that will determine the tools we select, and so that's point one, which is an extremely important reminder, and that what we're trying to develop and do is totally of a different order and ambition, complexity and richness, than what 30, 40 years was the outcome and end product. And I think I want to pick up on Greg's point that you have the distinction between drawing and drafting. And I think there is and we also had the kind of discussion of the productive vagueness of the sketch, the open-endedness, the kind of searching quality, precisely because we don't know perhaps even yet how to translate. And what we're looking for, this is kind of moment of searching and exploration, of developing intentions. And then I think there is a moment of homing in and running with these and elaborating these intentions. And that is not, I don't think, not in perhaps in every individual's career, to a certain extent in every project, but more profoundly with each generation there's a historical cycles. And I believe that in the 70s and early 80s there was a kind of collective searching of potential intentions, of stimulations, of new solutions after the bankruptcy of modernism. And I think at that point the kind of Deleuzian open-ended diagramming, sketching and proliferation of formal universes was the order of the day. And I think to a certain extent, at that point maybe sketching was that kind of necessary moment. But I think then we developed collectively, I think, selecting out of these kind of random browsing, collective browsing, new intentions. And I want to come to the point that what Drake calls drafting, in the end, is also where the creative process lies and must lie, because as you know now what we're doing, we know now what we're aspiring to and how we're building it up. We're building it up with these tools. And it is not the one-liner of the intention sketch, the kind of vague glimpse of something where the creativity and transient, let's say, innovative creativity lies, but in the kind of next stage of elaborating that super dense, super elaborate, super affiliated and cross-communicated project. And that's where I think we're moving beyond the kind of dichotomy of creativity is with the drawing, with the sketch, with the intention, and the rest is execution. Creativity.
It's the longest sentence I have ever heard.
I got my point across.
Poor Patrick, you can't get it.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, George.
You want us to sit down?
Yeah, you have to go back.
Thank you all for that great discussion. Everyone here probably knows that Symposium, a Greek friend of mine recently told me this, a symposium actually meant to drink together. And so Victor and I had requested that craters of wine be brought in and couches, et cetera, and we were told to hold our breaths for that. So that will occur immediately following Mario Carpo's talk here. And before I introduce Mario, I wanted to say on behalf of Victor and myself to restate our gratitude to the Dean for his unfailing support of this symposium. To the Miller family for their very generous contribution to making this happen, to our colleagues who have been invaluable to us along the way, and finally and most importantly to all the participants who've created an incredibly vibrant weekend of discussion about drawing. Thank you. Okay, our next and final speaker is Mario Carpo. Mario is an architectural historian who has taught throughout Europe and the United States, including the School of Architecture at Paris La Villette, the University of Geneva in Switzerland, Georgia Tech, Cornell University, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Williams College, and the Yale School of Architecture, where he's the Vincent Scully Visiting Professor in Architectural History. He's the author of several books and articles, including the award-winning Architecture in the Age of Printing, 2001, Perspective, Projections, and Designs, for which he was a co-editor in 2007, and most recently, The Alphabet and the Algorithm, published by MIT Press in 2011. Mario Carpo.
Thank you. Oops. Can you hear me? Good. Thank you all. I have the duty to be brief, and I shall be brief. Unless I fall asleep while I'm reading my own paper, in which case it may take a bit longer, but let's hope not. If there is one conclusion, which I think we may safely draw after today of passionate, interesting papers, discussion, moderation, and speculation, is that evidently we make drawings for many different reasons. Different reasons means different agendas, different formats, different tools, different technologies. Handmade drawings, for example, often serve as personal memory aids, or to probe and investigate shapes and forms. From diagrams drawn in the sand, to sketches on paper, to doodles on the screen of an iPad, this kind of drawing will exist forever. There is no risk of extinction here. The drawing we have just seen of Michael Graves, and if need be, the drawings exhibited upstairs by Massimo Scolari prove that beyond any reasonable doubt. And this is where I could, leave, and that's the end. We have answered the topic, except. But there are other drawings which architecturally occasionally they have to make to communicate with others. And to do so, the maker and the user of a drawing must use the same language. For architectural drawings, this language has often been that of descriptive geometry. Now, how do I move the picture on the screen?
The computer expert.
Oh, here. Good.
No.
Now I have to.
Where do you want to go?
Oh, yes, but I see. It works. Thanks.
Okay.
Good. I go back to the line before. For architectural drawing, this language has often been that of descriptive geometry, here on the screen. And before the invention of modern descriptive geometry, that of its early modern predecessors, such as this one. These geometrical drawings have been the main tool of our trade for most of the last 5 centuries, and we tend to think that their functions and uses are timeless and universal. This is not so, and the digital turn has recently reminded us of this truism. when culture and technology change, some cultural technologies may actually die out to be replaced by new ones. Architecture has not always been an art of drawing. Quite the opposite. For most of its history in the West, architecture was a craft of making. Classical and medieval builders did not use many drawings. Often, they used no drawings at all. Yet, evidently, they built, sometimes surprisingly well. The use of drawings for architectural notation was a cultural and technical invention of the Renaissance. And the theory underpinning this invention can be traced to one man, Leon Battista Alberti, who around 1450 wrote a still famous book to claim right that, namely that architects should make drawings, not buildings. In Alberti's theory, architecture is conceived in the mind, expressed through drawings, then built, but built by others. Building is none of the architect's business. Architects should make clean drawings and ship them to whomever may need them. Period. Even today, this principle of absolute separation between drawing and building seems to go against common sense. And at the time when Alberti first asserted it, it must have made no sense at all. Yet the Albertian way of building by notation was in time amazingly successful. And among other things, it created our profession as it exists to this day. 550 years after this Florentine invention, Alberti's paradigm is enshrined in the legislation and embedded in the social practices of most countries around the world. Modern architects do not cut stones, they cut pencils. With said pencils, they make drawings, which they send to the builders, who will follow these drawings to make actual buildings, which in the end will be just the same as the building the designer had originally conceived in his mind. These are Alberti's words. But that is the theory, Alberti's theory. And Alberti knew well that his whole theory depended on a dual condition, that the designer may translate the totality of a building into drawings, and that the builders may reconvert these drawings into the totality of a building. To this end, Alberti developed a new and in many ways revolutionary theory of geometrical notations. Alberti famously distinguished between two classes of architectural drawings. Drawings which represent a building as it appears to the eye, pictorial drawings, and drawings which convey instruction for building, or technical notations. Pictorial drawings must use perspective, the right thing Alberti should say, since he had invented perspective only a few years before. Technical notations, like that. Technical notations, on the contrary, must rely exclusively on scale drawings in plan, elevations, and side views, a few years later, sections. Unlike perspective, these drawings preserve measurements and angles without distortions. Today, we call these drawings orthographic projections or parallel projections. Alberti could not call them that way because the geometry of parallel projection did not yet exist at the time, which is why he, Alberti, had to find some other non-projectival and slightly devious way to define them. Having done so, somehow, he could go on and claim that technical notations in plan, elevations, and side views, a few years later sections, must be as transparent as possible, because their purpose is to convey to the builders all, and by all, Alberti really meant all aspects of a building. For in Alberti's theory, the drawing is the building. And the building is only, so to speak, the identical copy of an idea notated in drawing. Evidently, Alberti's project aimed at an ideal goal which was known to be, and perhaps even meant to be, forever out of reach. What blueprint, another term which Alberti could not have used, what blueprint could anticipate all, and by all, like Alberti, I really mean all the aspects of a building to be, down to the colors of the carpets, the model of the Venetian blinds, the design of the faucets and door handles, or nylon wheels. The Albertian paradigm, the intellectual ambition to encapsulate a whole building in its drawn notation, must allow for plenty of practical accommodations, adjustments, and compromises. A gray area of bargaining, negotiation, arguments, and wishful thinking, where the designer can only hope that his intentions will, somehow, materialize. This may or may not happen, and the extension of this gray area of notational opacity is variable. Some great architects, like Mies van der Rohe, famously managed to shrink it significantly. Now this drawing, now on the screen, is a bit laconic, but it gives the idea somehow. I don't know which nylon wheel it was, but evidently it was a nylon wheel which Mies thought should be designed. But most normal architects cannot and do not work that way. From its inception, this fallacy has been more or less consciously embedded in the Albertian paradigm. We do our best to build by notation, but knowing full well the limits of allography, when others must act from a script we wrote. In every performance, there will be something we cannot control. Or at least, this was the case until the digital came about. Digital design and fabrication tools work in a very different way. When a file is sent to a CNC milling machine, and this is not just any milling machine, I think this is or was Greg's milling machine. Is it still? Good. So when you send a file to this machine, for example, pardon?
I have empathy towards that.
Good. And when we send a file to that or a similar milling machine, for example, the machine, just like Alberti's ideally mute and mindless workers, does not debate or discuss, interpolate or interpret. The machine can only print out and execute. If the digital notation is complete, the piece will be fabricated. If it isn't, the machine will not work. The piece as fabricated is, and can only be, the identical replication of design as notated. What we see on the designer's screen is what we get in the fabricator's shop. There can be no notational opacity in this logic because no machine can fill in the blanks or interpret the intentions of a digital design file. Today's file-to-factory design and fabrication technologies would hence appear to fulfill, literally, Alberti's dream and Heidegger's nightmare of a perfectly transparent, absolute notational tool. An unlikely conclusion and climax for an intellectual and technological project which started in Florence on the eve of the Renaissance. And yet, at a closer look, once again, things may not always be so easy. Today, digital file-to-factory technologies are successfully used for the fabrication of small items of a single material by subtraction and carving or by accretion of layers. But most buildings cannot be sculpted out of a single block of any material, with the exception perhaps of caves and grottos. nor buildings can be extruded by squishing building material like toothpaste out of a tube, like as in the case of a technology called contour crafting, which you see on the screen, which they claim works well to build on the moon. It has not been tested. A big building, like a big machine, is the result of the assembly of many different pieces. Many of these pieces can be individually fabricated, but at some point, all must be put together and assembled off-site and finally on-site, the building site. Unless we build on the moon, this process is likely to entail a huge variety of technologies and agents and actors, human and technical alike, which all must be made to work together somehow. Construction is not simply a scaled-up fabrication or fabrication made bigger. It is a different game altogether, and it requires a different approach. This approach, as interpreted and developed by the software industry in the last 10 years, has led to today's technologies of building information modeling. BIM allows for the construction of an interactive, three-dimensional digital model of the building itself, ideally a digital doppelganger of sorts, a 3D virtual anticipation of a building to be. This model is used to put together all the parts, regardless of their provenance, and to test them virtually before the actual building is built. In theory, all aspects and performances of a building should or could be tested this way, including the way a building looks. In a sense, the digital model can be seen as a building simulator, just like the flight simulators that are used to test pilots and machines without flying or crashing actual planes. Building simulation technologies are not quite there yet, but this is where they seem to be heading, and the consequences of this trend are momentous for the fortunes of architectural drawing, design, and possibly for the future of the architectural profession as well. From its beginning, and until 20 years ago, the Albertian notational strategy always had to cope with a critical shortage of processing power, in the sense that working in that way, in the Albertian way, always would have required much more processing power than any technology could provide at any time before the age of electronic computing. As a consequence, for the last 5 centuries, we had to invest a huge amount of effort, intelligence, and science in order to compress big 3D objects into small files. In fact, onto flat pieces of paper, because the flat piece of paper, the flat geometrical notation on paper, was the only one we could easily record, transmit, and process. Now, we can just as easily record, transmit, and process digital simulations of 3D objects just as they are in nature, namely in 3D. This does not toll the knell of handmade drawings. This tolls the knell of all notational drawings, regardless of their manual or mechanical nature. Descriptive geometry, a tool to compress big 3D objects into small, flat 2D diagrams, was a brilliant intellectual construction. As such, it is timeless, as well as a compression technology we simply do not need anymore, because today's digital machines are so much more powerful that they can process 3D objects just as they are, without the need to flatten them first, without any compression needed. But the shift from drawing to digital modeling has other momentous consequences. The logic of BIM posits that the making of digital models should be collaborative and interactive, just as the making of a real building. Philip Bernstein, who teaches in this school, has recently noted that digital tools facilitate and intensify design collaboration to such a degree that some old, indeed Albertian, notions of intellectual ownership in design are fast becoming obsolete, suggesting the need for a new model of shared decision-making among designers, contractors, and clients. As authorial notations, the traditional blueprint with a date, a name, and the signatures, and the stamp on it, as these are replaced by a virtual construction site, evolving in real time, while many specialists, designers, and contractors work together on the same parts of a virtual building. Some parts of the building will be increasingly designed by those who can prove they have the best ideas or solution, not necessarily by an architect. Of course, this mode of collaborative decision-making is not particularly new in our profession, nor indeed in any profession. What is new is the place where it happens, on the virtual building site of a digital model of a building to be. With a certain historical logic, the elimination of the Albertian authorial way of building by notation is bringing about a digital reenactment of some tools and modes of conception that prevailed in Europe on the eve of the Albertian revolution, the pre-Albertian physical models, for example, such as those that Brunelleschi used for the building of the Florence Dome, a case with which Alberti was familiar. But also and primarily, the pre-Albertian way of crafting a building on site, without notations, without design, but through argument, persuasion, and endless negotiation. Instead of crafting a real building on a real site, we can now craft a virtual building on a virtual site. But the open-ended process of collaborative decision-making is likely to be similar. And just like the guild-based medieval process, which Brunelleschi successfully tried to tweak to serve his own authorial ambitions, this new and very old mode of design by leadership is likely to be contentious, circuitous, argumentative, and as all that is based on dialogue, argument, and human interaction, it is likely to be confused, laborious, and often quite messy. We know how Brunelleschi built the dome, without design, other than that which he had in his mind, and kept for himself a secret to all for the whole time it took to build the dome, 18 years. But through endless tricks, arguments, persuasions, deception, and occasionally plain cheating. For 18 years, day in, day out, screaming, yelling, and stamping, Brunelleschi simply persuaded all on site to do what he had in mind. He did not use any drawing to this end. His favorite notational tools were turnips. When he had to give shape to his ideas, he carved 3D models out of turnips. Then he ate the turnips, so no evidence remained. We may or may not choose to use turnips today. After 5 centuries of Albertian, intellectual, and humanistic tradition in building, architecture is often seen as a fine art today, mostly unrelated to vegetables. Instead of turnips, we might as well fall back on that ancient tool of visual seduction, opaque illusion, and aesthetic persuasion we knew so well. Drawings. We used to be good at that. Thank you. Turnip. Oh, the turnip is gone.
The turnip is gone. It's being turned into vodka and gin and other lovely refreshments. I want to thank George Knight and Victor Agron for this marvelous symposium. They really did all the work. I take all the credit, but they did all the work. And I want to thank our participants for an incredibly stimulating day and day and a half. And I want to thank especially all the many of you who have come to visit. I apologize that we don't have an auditorium to seat the 600 people who have shown up for this, plus or minus 600 people for this symposium. But then again, as an architect, I was always told you don't build a church for Easter Sunday. Thank you very much. See you upstairs.